Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that I've been doing with Alexis Pauline Gumbs and her work on various types of Afrofuturist literature and various different understandings of like how we kind of come into contact with black feminist work in the context of the archive and the way that it relates to the context of the space privatization topic. If you haven't, because this is a mini series, I would definitely go back and watch the last two videos. There aren't going to be like a ton of videos for this series because very rarely do I ever like zone in on really like one author in particular, but I wanted to do so because I think that Alexis Pauline's Gumbs work is so interesting for this particular resolution that it would kind of be weird to kind of just like group her work in with like Afrofuturist stuff and not really like do something that like really talked about the way in which her particular writings about science, technology, capitalism, anti-blackness and stuff really intermingle with the context of like the space resolution. And I think that that's like super important. I also think that in the context of just like what you should kind of be thinking of like preparing for if you're trying to figure out like arguments that you think are like for the teams that are kind of like at the highest of your prep list that you know are going to read something that's like really surprising. This could definitely be one of those areas where you're kind of like figuring out arguments that you should prep for and like the ways that they respond to various other arguments. So hopefully this mini series kind of like helps out with people from a bunch of different vantage points. In this particular video I want to talk a little bit about criticisms, counterplans, and dissads, which I think is like super important in order to kind of like get a clear understanding of the way in which we want to like think about some of the other like most like I think popular arguments that you'll see against Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work and being able to just like create like considerable argumentation against them, which I think is like super important. I think that in the context of just like what you should be doing against criticisms, a lot of the arguments that I think work best from Alexis Gumbs are the arguments about like how like flexible and fluid the strategies that come from like black feminist theories are, that it's not really a question of just like whether or not there's this kind of like one practical thing to do in every scenario, but rather like what type of theoretical field is opened up by the types of imagination that is like done through the kind of like archiving process that Alexis Pauline Gumbs is really speaking through. I think that is really important to kind of like consider a lot of those things, because I think that the way in which her specific archival work talks about the importance of like how we kind of blend different kind of like perspectives of like what is kind of thought of as like professional academic and the various ways that like performative and other kind of type of instantiations of like aesthetic and literary work from black feminists kind of like really tend to have like a really strong impact on the way in which various material praxis come to be. And so it's not just like a direct one-to-one correlation that you read this thing in debate and material thing happens, but it also is like a lot more complicated than like trying to say that there is no relationship between the two and that the study is only one that doesn't do anything kind of like generative. Because I feel like what a strength that Alexis Pauline Gumbs has in her work is the way that she kind of like does and perform her own type of imaginative work as she's kind of like talking about like the history and the kind of like various archival kind of contact that's done between like her work and like other black feminists that I think is like super interesting. I also think that against like the criticisms, a lot of the other arguments that are really strong to make are ones where you really push the alternative. I definitely feel like a question of trying to figure out how the alternative is able to theorize black women, how it's able to theorize the various texture struggles that like black feminism as just like a set of scholarship is really attending to under their kind of like alternative frame without kind of like jettisoning or moving closer to some of like the affirmatives kind of methodology, I think is like super important in terms of how you're able to frame what competition looks like. I think that being able to kind of like push the lens on like why their alternative either can't make it to the same kind of like solvency threshold as yours can, as your affirmative method can, or by trying to win that their alternative solvency is kind of like sculpted into some of the various like strategies that like black feminists are kind of like using in their own work in these contexts is like super important. I also think that really asking prevalent questions about science, tech, and our relationship to the future are really important against these criticisms, because I feel like the work that Gumbs is doing is so detailed in the context of how science and technology kind of become revamped when we take this like much more apocalyptic look at the way in which like black feminist perspectives relate to those concepts, that there are a lot of arguments about like why those differential relationships to those conceptions create really different ways of like what those science and technology become and the way in which they show up in the material world. And so kind of to rupture that and make sense of that in the context of like the way in which they're theorizing what they think the future should kind of look like and other means, it's like I think really important to kind of like push the barrier on like how many like levels of offense they really have to deal with on the criticism. And I think like finally like incorporating a lot of your critiques of vitality and other kind of like things into any criticism that kind of moves into materiality, specifically like capitalism and like neoliberalism criticisms that are kind of like pushing you towards like having a praxis that is outside of what is identified as identity politics. A lot of them are only able to make weight by their ability to use a lot of the impact calculus that comes from the source of most of like what their links are leading to. And so I feel like you need to make like more arguments about like why you're kind of like the examples that are like done literally in the work of Gumbs not only disproves their arguments about praxis, but particularly why the detailed work that you're kind of doing by kind of like uncovering by like particularly like uncovering the ways in which like they're relating to questions of like what not only like the future is, but also like how we're able to think about the questions of like what life needs to be saved in the future are really pertinent to the questions of the impact comparison that they want to push forward. All of their arguments about like climate change, other kinds of like things that are erupting from capitalism, especially in the context of space, are things that are kind of like weighted outside of the context of like who is responsible for them. And I feel like that's kind of like a trend in the way in which people kind of like address the concerns of Black feminists like broadly. And I think it'd be really interesting for you to kind of like bring those arguments back into like some of the core of the debate that you're having in those places, because I think as you go to like the counterpart and dissad, some of that strategy remains really, really similar, where you really want to like lean onto this critique of like the idea of being able to create a restorative relationship to space that is able to kind of like save the human population and make us have this like belief in the current kind of systems that we live in as something that is like necessarily violent, and kind of like correlates to like various kind of like productions of the, like erasure that like maybe keep Black women like sutured to the way in which we kind of understand the present, and also destroys the kind of like alternative languages that they're kind of like building a relationship to like what the kind of like world kind of looks like from the perspective of like something that is a lot more apocalyptic. And I think that making arguments about why the type of fiat or the way that they kind of like imagine the kind of like ways in which their impacts come to be as endemic of like why there needs to be a differential relationship to how we're framing our relationship to time and space as like super important to kind of what these politics transition to the outside. And I think the combination of that is a really big indictment of like a lot of the impact comparison they're going to do, combined with like some really interesting arguments about how you can maybe solve some of their impacts through like different kind of like remixes of like what that science technology looks like under the pressure of like Black feminist work, are all really, really interesting places for you to kind of be like pushing them on like how their kind of conception of like what fiat should be in our relationship to futurism is overtaken by like a particular humanist reactionary like relationship to like what existential fears are about the end of humanity, and why those things don't really have the same type of like pressing concern or power the way in which Black feminists are theorizing. And thus that's why they kind of like arrive at such a different conclusion, and why kind of like dissecting and kind of like removing that imagination from the field of governmentality is particularly important to create a future that's like much more livable or survivable in the context of like how Black feminists are theorizing what the values kind of should be for like what we define as survivability, which are all I think really important to kind of like layering that offense against this type of position. And hopefully is good for giving you advice on how to deal with this and maybe some other stuff that I've talked about throughout these videos when you're being affirmative. And hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing for this mini series with Alexis Gumbs space privatization, and videos I'll be doing all together. Yeah, thanks as always.